Hello everyone, Ace here, and today let's talk about Just Some Guy, and how he is wrong about both the right as well as V in particular. This all started when Just Some Guy responded to a tweet from V, where V stated the difference between the left and the right is that the left believes in equality, the right believes in quality. This resulted in Just Some Guy accusing V and people on the right in general of being National Socialists, by comparing what V and apparently people on the right say to what National Socialists apparently said in the 1920s, and that the Holocaust itself was apparently done in the name of quality rather than equality. So let's talk about why Just Some Guy is wrong. And the first and perhaps biggest reason is that the Holocaust was absolutely done in the name of equality itself, because Hitler was a far leftist and not a member of the far right, despite what Just Some Guy may think. But I know what you're thinking. How could mass murder be seen as an example of attempting to achieve equality? And the answer is actually rather straightforward. Because had the National Socialists actually won the war and did everything they intended to do, then they would have killed everyone they didn't like, meaning that anyone who was left would have legally been treated as equals. In theory, anyways, as there is always the issue of governments being corrupt and all that. Now, if you think that it is ridiculous to look at the end goal of National Socialism as an ideology to explain why they did in fact push a variation of equality, well, I would have to counter any claims of ridiculousness by pointing out that it is completely in keeping with far leftist ideologies in general. The Marxists, for example, happily promote the idea of genociding the bourgeoisie, and yet no one is going to use that to suggest that the Marxists themselves are against equality. That said, I do need to further establish exactly how the National Socialists were in fact far leftist, and to do that, allow me to bring up some of the policies that they actually, in fact, pushed. Policies that far leftists will do absolutely everything in their power to lie about. For example, other far leftists will claim that National Socialists abolished unions. But by abolished, what they ultimately mean is merged all of the unions into a single government-backed super union called the German Labor Front. Because a single massive union that is actively being backed by the government is somehow abolishing unions altogether. Or how about the classic far leftist lie that the National Socialists privatized the economy, when what they really mean is that they nationalized factories from people they didn't like and then gave them to members of the Nazi Party directly, because Adolf Hitler running a factory personally is completely different from the government that Adolf Hitler ran running the factory. On that subject, I feel it's important to note that one of the very first things that the National Socialists did once they got in power was to completely abolish the private property rights via the Reichstag Fire Decree of 1933. Specifically, this decree, among other things, got rid of Articles 115 and 153 of the Weimar Constitution, these two articles being what guaranteed private property rights in the Weimar Republic. The very moment that the National Socialists did this, they had total control over the economy. Anyone that dare step out of line would have their property seized. The means of production were socially controlled, meaning that National Socialism was, by definition, a form of socialism. I could also talk about the fact that the National Socialists attempted to create a form of collective farming called the Erbhof system, which was an attempt at collective farming because it was intended that these farms would have their debts be collectivized. The National Socialists didn't actually get that far to collectivize the debts for these farms, but that was the plan. Now, so far, everything that I've said in this video has been covered by another YouTuber named TIK, who made a 5+ hour long video describing in detail exactly how and why National Socialism is socialism. But let's now move on to why the National Socialists had such a raging hate boner towards Jewish people, and why they targeted them. And the answer is ultimately because the National Socialists believed that Jewish people were the racial embodiment of capitalism, and they also believed that Jewish people were systemically oppressing German people, and thus they saw the Holocaust and the numerous things that they were doing towards the Jewish people as simply punching up against their oppressors. With that in mind, allow me to provide some quotes that perfectly demonstrate the mindset of the National Socialists. Quote, "The Christian state knows only privileges. In this state, the Jew has the privilege of being a Jew. As a Jew, he has rights which the Christians do not have. Why should he want rights which he does not have, but which the Christians enjoy?" This is a quote directly stating that Jewish people have Jewish privilege in Germany. Later, the author of the book goes on to state, quote, "Let us consider the actual worldly Jew, not the Sabbath Jew as Bauer does, but the everyday everyday Jew. Let us not look for the secret of the Jew in his religion, but let us look for the secret of his religion in the real Jew. What is the secular basis of Judaism? Practical need, self-interest. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. So yeah, that quote makes it very clear that the author of the book thinks that Jewish people are a money people and therefore a capitalist people. So you may be wondering who exactly is the author. Is it perhaps Joseph Goebbels, maybe Heinrich Himmler, or even Adolf Hitler himself? No, the actual author is Karl Marx, and the book in question is On the Jewish Question, written all the way back in the 1840s. Now, to be fair, Marx did make the book in response to another person in order to argue against how that other person claims that Jewish people should be treated. However, the idea that Jewish people are a money people is something that Karl Marx ultimately agreed with in the book, as the quotes very clearly lay out. My point is that the idea of linking Jewish people to the very idea of capitalism itself wasn't something that Adolf Hitler had personally invented, and it had in fact already been a part of socialist ideology for nearly a century up to that point. The main area where Hitler's National Socialism was different was its emphasis on race as being the key component to how it wanted to apply socialist principles, as well as how it viewed the ideas of oppressed and oppressor. But I know I left you with a little bit of blue balls by quoting Karl Marx instead of an actual National Socialist, so allow me to provide an actual direct quote from Adolf Hitler himself. "We do not believe that there could ever exist a state with lasting inner health if it is not built on internal social justice. And so we have joined forces with this knowledge." This is from Adolf Hitler's Why We Are Anti-Semites speech from 1920. This is Adolf Hitler arguing that his ideology of National Socialism is an ideology of, quote, social justice. Adolf Hitler unironically claimed to be a social justice warrior in the 1920s. But if you thought the linkage to the far left ended there, well, you would be very, very wrong. For a start, let's talk about Adolf Hitler's politics up to that point. Because if you're wondering how Adolf Hitler, a man who would go on to really hate communists, would be influenced by Marxist rhetoric and literature. And the answer is because in the spring of 1919, Hitler himself was an open communist. In fact, he was a minor elected official of the Bavarian Soviet Republic, a Soviet republic that, by the way, was praised by Vladimir Lenin himself. These are facts that, as you could probably tell, both National Socialists and Communists really hate being brought up. But something else that I believe that leftists in general will really hate being brought up is the subject of Völkisch equality. Now you may be wondering what Völkisch equality is. Well, it's the National Socialist term for what we today refer to as affirmative action. And yes, historically speaking, these were programs created by the National Socialists in Germany in order to combat the supposed systemic oppression they claim to face at the hands of Jewish people. Affirmative action as a concept is a product of Nazi ideology, and to some degree is also a product of what ultimately became the Holocaust. Because as leftists have liked to point out in the past, the Holocaust didn't start with the death camps. What they don't like to point out is the fact that it started with Völkisch equality, at least once we get into actual government policy. So those are the big reasons why National Socialism is in fact a form of socialism and therefore a far leftist ideology. But while I'm here, allow me to also counter some of the very popular arguments that far leftists will try to use to debunk what I have said here. For a start, allow me to address the argument that Hitler and the National Socialists weren't real socialists because they killed socialists. There are two reasons why that argument falls completely flat. For a start, Hitler and the National Socialists also killed other National Socialists. So for that logic to remain consistent, that would mean that Hitler and his National Socialists were not National Socialists. As you could probably tell, that is a completely nonsensical statement. And thus, the logical conclusion is that just because the National Socialists killed National Socialists doesn't prevent them from being National Socialists. And by extension, just because the National Socialists killed socialists does not prevent them from being socialists either. The second reason why this argument falls completely flat is because every single far leftist regime in history has killed socialists. The Communist Soviet Union has killed socialists. Communist China has killed socialists. Communist Vietnam has killed socialists. Communist North Korea has killed socialists. Communist Cuba has killed socialists. Communist Yugoslavia has killed socialists. Communist Cambodia has killed socialists. Communist Ethiopia has killed socialists. And the list goes on and on and on. Every single far leftist leftist regime in history has killed socialists. There's even cases of communist countries outright going to war against one another, such as when communist China invaded communist Vietnam because communist Vietnam invaded communist Cambodia. This all happened in the late 70s for those who are curious. And it's important to note because this is something that Marxism suggests should not actually happen. Marxist countries are not supposed to go to war with one another as far as the ideology itself is concerned. It's almost as if the reality of Marxism is completely different from the fantasy of Marxism presented by Marx and Engels themselves. And on that subject, that brings me over quite cleanly to the next thing that far leftists will use as a gotcha to claim that the National Socialists aren't socialist, that being that they embraced ultranationalism, and that this somehow proves that they are right-wing. The reason why this falls flat is that, contrary to Marxist theory, the reality is that every single far-left regime in history has also embraced ultranationalism as well. Typically, it is a form of civic nationalism, although that is not universally the case, as communist Cambodia absolutely was trying to be an ethno-nationalist state. But my point is, once again, far-leftists are trying to use the argument that the National Socialists were right-wing because they did something that every other far leftist regime in history has also done. And again, that is a nonsensical argument. Hopefully, with this in mind, it all starts to make it a little bit more sense why we are starting to see examples of other far leftists now actively defending National Socialism by claiming that at least it wasn't as bad as the United States during World War II. And yes, we now have far leftists actively making that argument on Twitter. Because yes, socialists absolutely hate other forms of socialism, as demonstrated by the fact that every single socialist regime in history has killed socialists. That still doesn't exactly mean that they aren't willing to team up, if temporarily, against capitalism. This also may explain that time a few years back when a couple of professors decided to get together to prove political bias within academia by publishing a feminist rewrite of Mein Kampf, at which point the feminist Mein Kampf was immediately praised by left-wing feminists for promoting a message of feminine solidarity, something that absolutely would not happen if Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler, or the National Socialists were pushing a far-right ideology. So why am I going into such great detail on why the National Socialists are far left? Well, it is because, as I have stated, Just Some Guy's entire argument is built upon the premise that the National Socialists were right-wing, and that the Holocaust that they committed was not done in the name of equality. By pointing out that the National Socialists were in fact socialist and far left, as well as pointing out that the Holocaust itself was very much done in the name of equality, at least if you look at the end goal, what I am doing here is refuting Just Some Guy's central point. If the Holocaust was done in the name of equality, as I've presented, then he can't argue that quality leads directly to the Holocaust. He also can't argue that the conservatives are exactly like the National Socialists if I point out that, historically speaking, the National Socialists were in fact far left. In fact, if anything, if we actually do the analysis that Just Some Guy wants, it starts to paint a rather negative picture of Just Some Guy, or at least of the political spectrum from which he resides. But the thing is, conservatives are not as close-minded as Just Some Guy is, whereas Just Some Guy will flat out imply that everyone right of center is secretly a National Socialist, when he said, quote, "It's funny that the right were saying the same thing in Europe 100 years ago." And I need to emphasize he said, quote, "the right," and not, quote, "some of the right." So he can't even be charitable and say that he's only talking about some Republicans here. He is in fact implying that every single Republican thinks in a way that would directly lead to the Holocaust. But as I've said, by contrast, conservatives are not as stringent or as narrow-minded as Just Some Guy is here. There's a reason that there are people left of center, for example, such as Short Fat Otaku, who have a considerable audience from the right. And yes, while they may have disagreements, and while I personally have disagreed with Short Fat Otaku from time to time, I can personally say that my disagreements have remained cordial with the man, something that I suspect Short Fat Otaku would be willing to back up. To take it a step further, there's also people like Shuan Head, who still manages to get a significant audience from people who are right of center. And one suspects that part of the reason has to do with the fact that Shuan Head isn't saying that every single person right of center is a National Socialist. My point is that the extreme tribalism on display here isn't exactly coming from the conservatives, now is it? That's not to say that it's impossible for conservatives to become tribalistic. However, looking at the facts on the ground, that does not appear to have been what has transpired here. Now, for those curious, I will of course be leaving links in the description below to the sources I have used, as well as to Just Some Guy's video, so you can check everything out if you should so desire. But in any case, this has been Ace. Hope to see you guys again soon. Take care. Ace out.